Among the great lovers stand Antony and Cleopatra. Within the palms of their hand lie the world, Egypt and Rome. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra tower above all others, yet their human flaws are obvious and excessive. Their turbulent romance drives all other actions, personal or public, within this play. Shakespeare's ingeniously created story of love and multiple betrayals. Aristotle describes these reversals as a change to the opposite in the actions being performed, in accordance with probability or necessity. In Act 4, Scene 12 of Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra, the audience expectations are thwarted by a reversal, proving Aristotle's belief that reversals within a complex play heighten the audience's emotional reaction. A human interest in understanding the other encourages Shakespeare's audience to become invested in Antony and Cleopatra's relationship, laying the foundation for the viewer's emotional connection to the characters. Understanding is the channel through which humans perceive the world. The preface to Aristotle's Poetics asserts humans are conditioned to know what is the thing to do in a certain situation and why it is the thing to do. As Antony and Cleopatra's audience is introduced to the characters, they begin to try to understand these individuals. When Antony and Cleopatra act contrary to logical reason, the audience enters into a state of the unknown, heightening their curiosity and emotional investment within the play. Supporting Aristotle's claim that action contrary to the audience's logical expectations inflicts pity and fear on the viewer, demonstrating the power of a complex plot. The organized structure of Act 4, Scene 12, heightens the effect of this plot reversal upon the audience, compelling them to feel extreme pity for Antony. In merely 23 lines, Shakespeare brilliantly masterminds Cleopatra's betrayal of Antony. Paralleling the shocking betrayal, Shakespeare introduces the audience into this plot reversal in a sudden and astonishing way. Without any pretense, the act opens to Antony furiously venting about his navy's great failure. My fleet hath yielded to the foe, and yonder they cast their caps and carouse together like friends long lost. This is the first time the audience is introduced to Antony's plight. The delivery of this information is unexpected, sudden, and abrasive. The word yielded describes Antony's loss as a dishonorable one, in which the men instantly bend before Rome. Meanwhile, his enemies cast their caps and carouse. Due to its sing-songy nature and high CA sounds, Antony's alliteration of cast, caps, and carouse verbally depicts Antony's understanding of his bitter enemy's excessively jubilant celebration. Contrastingly, Antony's disheartened state with that of his foe emphasizes the navy's failure and Antony's anger. Aristotle believes the plot is the source and soul of a tragedy. So, the structure of Shakespeare's sections of this event must be such that the transposition or removal of any one section dislocates and changes the whole. Additionally, omission of the actual betrayal heightens the dramatic of the plot reversal. It is important to realize that the audience does not witness this betrayal on stage. Therefore, the audience sees this information through the lens of Antony's fury, which is colored by disheartened and mocking language. The magnitude of the plot reversal is increased exponentially by the greatness of change from good fortune to bad fortune. Antony and Cleopatra's relationship have been at its peak. In this act, Antony reveals his love and devotions for Cleopatra. In Antony's past, Cleopatra's mere flesh and blood became his crownet and chief end, beckoning forth wars and calling them home again. Cleopatra enticed Antony so, to the extent that the value of his own existence was based upon her love. Even his political power, his honor, lie in her womanly hands. Aristotle explains that this closeness between humans makes their betrayal of one another horrendous. Humans are connected with interconnections between people who are closely connected with each other. Therefore, suffering is greatest when it arises within a close relationship. Only one line later, his second speech concludes, "The witch shall die. To the young Roman boy she has sold me. I fall under this plot. She dies for it." Cleopatra is no longer a jewel, but a witch. Antony and Cleopatra's relationship fell from such great heights, infinite acts of love, to a chaotic jumble of violently spoken words. The plot reversal is further demonstrated through an outpouring of speech and condemnation, thereby increasing the audience's emotional connection to the text. Aristotle claims knowledge or ignorance of diction does not give rise to any criticism relative to the art of poetry that is actually worth taking seriously. Contrary to his views, language is essential to manipulating the emotions of the audience because speech gives power to the speaker. Act 4, Scene 12, Shakespeare's language heightens Antony's thundering anger toward Cleopatra. In 33 lines, Cleopatra speaks only 8 words and 1 line. Speech is power. Without it, a character has little representation. Antony's outpouring of speech is his way of overpowering Cleopatra and dominating her. These hateful rants are littered with short, choppy sentences, highlighting the confusion and devastated state Antony has slipped into. The start and stop motion of the language creates a feeling of chaos and confusion, as if the sky is falling, paralleling Antony's mood after he had been betrayed by his love. Within Antony's 32 spoken lines, he accuses, condemns, and threatens Cleopatra, permitting the audience to understand the immensity of Cleopatra's betrayal. Antony's use of accusatory language manipulates the audience, causing them to pity Antony and abhor Cleopatra. The past tense phrases, betrayed me, sold me, beguiled me, indicate that action is being forced upon an unwilling subject, painting Antony as an innocent standby being attacked without cause. By contrast, Cleopatra is the actor against Antony. Naturally, the audience sides with the individual who seems to be under attack. Ironically, in this passage, it is actually Cleopatra who is being verbally abused. The language Shakespeare uses forces the audience to pity Antony and forget to register his wrongdoings. Aristotle's definition of tragedy is the imitation of an action that is admirable, complete, and possesses magnitude. But it must also be in language made pleasurable, affecting through pity and fear the purification of such emotions. It is the skillfully chosen language that sways the viewer to pity Antony. The audience is captivated by the immensity of the reversal of plot through both reasoning and sound. Cleopatra's portrayal is exaggerated by the insulting phrases Antony speaks. Ripping into Cleopatra, Antony spits out these insults: triple-turned whore, false soul of Egypt, both of which question her loyalty and her morality. The overwhelming F and T sounds embedded in Antony's insults give him a lyrical power over Cleopatra. Short F sounds are called frigatives, which are created by friction over airflow from the lungs. Sound is heard with the release of this energy passing through the mouth. The T sound is considered a stop, plosive, or explosive. This dramatic sound is formulated by letting pressure build up behind the tongue and the release of air. This creates a T sound. In Antony's speech, in between lines 10 and 49, he uses an F or T sound over 100 times. These sounds attack out of the mouth, forcing the noise to be heard, giving lyrical power to Antony's hurtful phrases. In Act 4, Scene 12, Shakespeare utilizes plot and language to engineer a powerful reversal, supporting Aristotle's belief that a reversal can manipulate the audience's emotion. By nature, humans find pleasure in understanding one another. To logically categorize and manipulate the audience, the actions of others in accordance to habit or pattern. It is in this instinct that propels the audience to connect with the stories and the characters they are presented with when viewing a play. When a character's actions or words contradict what is understood to be rational, it pushes the audience beyond their own understanding of the world. They The play thus becomes more than a mimic of reality, more than narrow-minded logic, but a space of infinite possibilities. This constant connection and then separation between the audience and the actors propels the greatness of the tragedy and emotion felt. For a fleeting instant, the irrational becomes rational. Thank you.
Okay, so the title of my essay is Powerful Faith. In his Poetics, Aristotle defines tragedy as an imitation of events that evoke fear and faith. But according to Aristotle, plot is far more important to a tragedy than the verbal text of a tragedy could ever hope to be. To Aristotle, language is tragedy's medium. It is the mean to tragedy's end, the end being the imitation of the action. In Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra, however, great importance can be attributed to the language itself. Often, the main focus of a scene turns away from plot to focus on language, especially when there is little action taking place at that given moment. It is through language, as well as actions, that characters' reputations are created. Arguably, the most powerful descriptive language takes place when the character being described is physically absent from the scene at the moment of description. Whether reading the play or watching it, the grand language used by characters to describe Antony and Cleopatra in their absence serves to lift them up in reputation to a height their mere actions never would have allowed them to reach. Such is the power of words. When Antony is called back to Rome towards the beginning of the play, Cleopatra famously daydreams of him in his absence. She lifts him up with her language, calling him the demi-atlas of the earth, the arm and virginet of man. Her praise is dramatic and seems to endow Antony with godlike qualities. He is no longer just a man in Cleopatra's eyes, rather his absence has allowed for her to perfect his image in her memory. These depictions of Antony are not just for Cleopatra's benefit, or even for Charmian's, the attendant with whom she is speaking at the moment. This description of Antony alleviates some of the damage done to Antony's reputation by Philo in the first lines of the play. The audience no longer has to take Philo's word for it that Antony is nothing more than the triple pillar of the world, transformed into a strumpet spool. By the time that Cleopatra has her chance to praise Antony in his absence, the audience has already had some time to observe him on stage and form their own opinions. Antony's absence from the scene is what allows Cleopatra to be so dramatic in her description of him. Because she is not describing him as he is, but rather how she holds his image in her mind. It is important to note that the power with which the praise is delivered on stage can make or break its efficacy. If the actor playing Cleopatra can make the words sound believable, then the audience may be swayed, especially because Antony's absence during the moment of her praise is what focuses us only on her portrayal of Antony. The imagery Cleopatra uses to describe Antony after his death is even more dramatic, and rightly so, as words and memories are all that is left of Antony in the remainder of the play. Cleopatra begins by comparing Antony's face to the heavens themselves. Her words are a eulogy to Antony, and her words are a eulogy to the Antony she began to create in his absence during the first act. Again, the language lifts up Antony's memory to a place the mere man himself might have been unable to reach. His legs bestrid the ocean. His reared arms crested the world. His voice was property that all the tuned spheres, and that to friends, but when he meant to quail and shake the orb, he was as rattling thunder. For his bounty there was no winner in it. In autumn 'twas that grew more by a weaving. His delights were dolphin-like. They showed his back above the elements they lived in. In his livery walked crowns and crownets, realms and islands where his plates dropped from his pocket. Her description of his abilities is absolute. His legs did bestride the ocean. His arms did crest the world. It is not as if Cleopatra wishes to say that Antony was almost capable of these godlike feats. Clearly, her language is meant to express her firm belief that Antony was in fact capable of the actions that she described. Similarly, Enobarbus uses the power of his words to describe the Queen Cleopatra to Agrippa and Mycenaeus, while he and Antony are in Rome. As with Cleopatra's description of Antony, Cleopatra herself is absent during his description of her. The words Enobarbus uses and the images they draw forth are what lift Cleopatra up in the eyes of Rome, and perhaps more importantly, in the eyes of the audience as well. His words dress her up in the part of Egypt's queen in a way she herself is unable to do given her absence. For although she is queen of Egypt regardless of what Enobarbus might say, she is now visibly more queen-like in the eyes of Agrippa and Mycenaeus, thanks to the power of Enobarbus' words. I will tell you, the barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver. to which the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. For her own person, it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold of tissue, we're picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outward nature. On each side stood pretty dimpled boys, like smiling cupids, with different-colored fans, whose wind did seem to blow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid, did. First, Enobarbus sets the scene for his introduction of Cleopatra, much in the way the queen herself would have set her surroundings to impress her listeners, on the greatness of Egypt's queen. Only after it has been established that her barge is gold, perfumed, and has purple sails, does Enobarbus begin to describe her own person. Much as Cleopatra compared Antony to Atlas, Enobarbus compares Cleopatra to Venus, and it is obvious that Shakespeare does not intend the parallel between the protagonists and the gods to go unnoticed by the audience. Even Cleopatra herself is aware of the power words inhabit a play, especially on her own reputation. It is clear that after it is clear that Caesar has won these battles with Egypt and that Antony is dead, Cleopatra worries about the effect depictions of her, especially in Rome, will have upon her memory. Her exact fear is that she shall see some squeaking Cleopatra boy belay her greatness in the posture before. She worries that these depictions of her in future Roman plays will be enough to lower her reputation from its lofty heights down to a place where her legacy will have nothing of its former greatness left in her. Knowing that she will be able to leave a lasting impression with her own death that might be strong enough to battle the words used against her, Cleopatra is eager to play the part of the dying queen with all the possible greatness in her last moments. She has Charmian give her one of her queenly robes, as well as her crown, because she is aware that in order to be the part, she must dress the part. Aristotle would argue that the plot is what drives the tragedy in this play, but it seems as if the possibility inherent in language is what drives Cleopatra to action. Her need to prove herself worthy of a eulogy as moving as the one she spoke for Antony seems to be one of the major factors driving her actions. Shakespeare chooses to leave the final words of the play, and consequently, the final descriptions of Antony and Cleopatra, in the hands of Caesar. His words close the play, and his description of them as a pair so famous becomes their defining aspect. They will forever be remembered as a pair, the two of them buried together. His words are what summarize Antony and Cleopatra, despite all that has been said about them, and all that they have had to say about one another. For if there's anything more powerful than language, it is the timing and placement with which the language is used.
Cleopatra's power over Antony. Antony and Cleopatra by Shakespeare is a tragic tale of two lovers who try to assert their power over one another, which leads to their deaths. Aristotle's Poetics describes the many aspects of poetry and specifically defines tragedy. What these two works have in common is that one was written for imitation, while the other was written to teach how to provide the correct style of imitation. The power of language is displayed in Antony and Cleopatra when Cleopatra wants to use her power over characters to be in control, and Aristotle tells the actor how to portray that language admirably through acting and displaying emotions. Cleopatra uses the power of her language to gain and maintain control of the situation, demonstrating to the audience the magnitude of her power. It is evident from the beginning of the play that Cleopatra knows how to manipulate others with her language and tone in order to get what she wants. In Act 1, Scene 3, Cleopatra is asking Charmian where Antony is, and they discuss how to make Antony love her by deceiving him. When he enters the scene, Cleopatra immediately pretends she is sick and starts her battle of language. When she says, "Help me away, dear Charmian, I shall fall. It cannot be this long. The sides of nature will not sustain it." She is clearly deceiving Antony by being overdramatic in her language to bring him closer to her. Her exaggeration leads the audience to clearly see her deceit and view Cleopatra as someone who goes to any extreme to get what she wants. When Antony responds by saying, "Now, my dearest queen," she cuts him off immediately, which is how many of Antony's responses are treated, showing her lack of respect for him and need to stay in control. Antony's responses are interrupted abruptly because Cleopatra wants to assert her control to reel him in, while in fact she is pushing him away. Her assertion of power over him makes him appear weak to the audience. Within that same scene, Antony starts off his speech more powerful than before, with his grand statement of, "Hear me, Queen," but then weakens himself with the assurance of his love. My full heart remains in use with you." Reassuring her of his love shows the audience that although he may have finally gotten her attention, her determination to bring him closer has worked, proving how much control she has over him without him realizing. In Aristotle's Poetics, he describes tragedy as an imitation of an action that is admirable, performed by actors, not through narration, effecting through pity and fear the purification of such emotions. While this might be true in some plays, these characteristics are not all true for the tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra. Aristotle first says that a tragedy is an imitation of an action that is admirable, but in the case of Antony and Cleopatra, their actions are not admirable. Deceptiveness and betrayal are not actions that are admirable in a character of high status and therefore do not apply to this tragedy. While some might question whether they need to be admirable or not, the audience expects admirable characters, especially in one as powerful as Cleopatra. Aristotle also wants a tragedy to be performed by actors, not through narration, which is true in this tragedy. Because there is not a narrator describing what happens, it is almost safe to say that Aristotle is right in this case, but he is also incorrect because some of the secondary characters seem to act as narrators throughout the play. When characters like Enobarbus give the audience information about what is happening before Antony and Cleopatra act it out, they're performing a type of narration by receiving details before the actions. The type of narration that characters like Enobarbus bring is similar to gossip, leading to an informal and scandalous narration of the events. In Act 2, Scene 5 of Antony and Cleopatra, a messenger appears and Cleopatra immediately cuts him off, thinking that Antony is dead. She threatens the messenger many times, describing to him what she will do if he is lying, which from the start asserts her dominating tendencies over him. She also tells him how he should act if Antony is dead by proposing, "Thou shalt come like a fury crowned with snakes, not like a formal man." By threatening the messenger and telling him how to act, she is reminding him of the power she has with her language. This demonstrates to the audience the extravagance that she expects from the messenger, making her outrageous and glamorous. The messenger replies, "Will it please you hear me?" But Cleopatra has to have the final say in order to prove to the audience the magnitude of her power and assert her dominance over the other characters. Just as Cleopatra starts to praise the messenger for the good news about Antony, he tells her, "But yet, madam," which infuriates her. This forces her to reassert her dominance over the messenger by explaining how that phrase makes her angry and demanding the full truth. The minute Cleopatra knows she does not have control over the people around her, she feels the need to reinforce it with her long speeches. These speeches show the audience that she is the one in control, making the audience sympathize with the messenger. She will even go as far as violence towards others in order to display the amount of control she holds. Long speeches are not the only way she asserts her power. In Act 2, Scene 5, she yells one phrase of the messenger, "Rogue, thou hast lived too long," proving to the reader and audience she believes herself to be as powerful as a god by threatening to take his life. This powerful remark makes the audience feel more sympathy for him because of Cleopatra's erratic language and behavior. In Act 3, Scene 7, Cleopatra persuades Antony to go to war with Caesar by sea without explicitly saying so. In this way, she is using her power over Antony to control his actions without him knowing. When he asks her, "You have heard on it, sweet?" he is asking for her approval, showing the audience his weakness to her later deciding to fight by sea under her implicit command. Antony loses the war with Caesar, making him feel ashamed of his decision and in turn making the audience feel sympathy for him. Even though Cleopatra is not speaking over him, the power she has over his heart in choosing to go to war makes Antony feel ashamed, showing the audience his submissiveness to Cleopatra's dominance. There is a shift in power from Cleopatra to Antony when he realizes that Cleopatra is to blame for him losing the war. He says, "This foul Egyptian hath betrayed me." meaning that Cleopatra betrayed him, and for once in the play, Antony asserts his power over her with long speeches and barely allowing her to speak. Although this upsets her, she is not defeated and goes on to pretend she has killed herself to regain control. This is one of the few times where her actions are more powerful than her language. By tricking him into thinking she is dead, she forces him to forget about his anger and love her again. The change in tone from anger to sadness shows Cleopatra's dominance over him and Antony's submissiveness to her, even after her supposed death. The forged suicide leads the audience to feel anger towards Cleopatra's deceit and sympathy for Antony falling into her power again. Her power over him even drives him to attempt suicide in Act 4, Scene 14. The last part of Aristotle's definition of a tragedy states, affecting through pity and fear the purification of such emotions, which is partially true in the tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra. When the audience experiences the play, there is an emotion of pity, not for Cleopatra when she is deceitful, but for Antony when he gives into her deceit. There is also pity for the messenger when Cleopatra attacks him for simply delivering a message. The audience pities Antony in his suicide attempt when Cleopatra is really alive, but it is difficult for the audience to pity Cleopatra in her sadness of him dying because she has brought this tragic ending on herself. Fear is also an emotion the audience feels as well as the characters, but only during certain situations. It could be said that Cleopatra can assert her power easily over Antony because he fears her, but it seems more possible that she can assert her power over him because he loves her and will do anything for her. The love Antony has for Cleopatra that allows her to dominate him is what drives him to his actions, not fear. In contrast, the messenger fears Cleopatra after her outburst towards him, which in turn makes the audience feel fearful for him as well. The audience and the characters feel both pity and fear, but it varies between the characters and their actions. Although these two literary works do not directly coincide, Aristotle's concepts on tragedy can easily be applied to Antony and Cleopatra. In the entirety of the play, Cleopatra and, in some instances, Antony successfully assert their power over one another as well as the other characters. This power struggle eventually leads to their tragic ending, which was brought on by Cleopatra's need to be in control and be greedy for Antony's love. The characters of Antony and Cleopatra are not the admirable characters the audience wants them to be. There is a gossip type of narration, and while evoking pity and fear, they also evoke sadness and love. Antony does not submit to Cleopatra because he fears her, but because he loves her. There is not always pity of the characters, but sadness that Antony let Cleopatra dominate him so easily. Antony and Cleopatra will always be a tragedy of two lovers, but not always in Aristotle's terms. Thank you.
My paper is titled Aggressive Beauty. Opera is one of the most beautiful forms of art. The manner in which music, language, and poetry coalesce to create a dramatic narrative is remarkable. But to a certain degree, this beauty is intangible. The apparent ease at which the familial, political, and romantic tensions are resolved in Giuseppe Verdi's opera, Simone Boccanegra, is entirely impracticable. Sigmund Freud ushers a realistic interpretation of the human drive and asserts that it is aggression that drives man, not romantic love, family, and friendship. The opera audience must distinguish the difference between the beautifully moving language of the opera and the innateness of aggression in man and recognize that both cannot be based in reality. Aggression is reality, opera is pure fantasy. Act 1, Scene 1 of Boccanegra opens with a beautiful aria sung by the soprano Amelia. Set in the garden of the Grimaldi Palace, the set design alone allows the audience to escape and find a moment of serenity. Coupled with the romanticism between Amelia and Gabriele, this beautiful exchange departs from Freud's analysis of human aggression and gives the audience an unrealistic impression of natural human behavior. Amelia begins singing, remarking, "Oh, how the stars are smiling, the sea is dark and friendly, oh, how the moon is shining, to touch the crest of the wave. Ah, it seems to nestle gently like tender hearts in love." She goes on to describe tender moments of her life, revealing the fact that she was orphaned and lived through a tragic experience as a child. Her voice and the music at this point in the opera are more illuminating than her language could be. The subtly dramatic increase in volume and enhanced staccato of her voice at the end of each sentence as her lover approaches makes the audience feel excitement with her and feel as though they are with her experiencing the same emotional thrill as she anticipates her lover's arrival. When the long-awaited entrance of Gabriele is finally made, he entices both Amelia and the audience with his heart-stopping words, made all the more impressive when sung by a man in Italian. A sky when no stars are shining, a field where flowers are dying, is a soul devoid of love. The language he uses is intoxicating in its sweetness, but his romantic inclinations create a disconnect between audience and performer. In this scene, it becomes evident that the love felt between Amelia and Gabriele is so intensely passionate that beyond Verdi's characters, few could ever dream in achieving such a level of adoration. Adding to the divide between fantasy and reality is the tragic past of the orphaned Amelia. Her aria reveals a dark past that has hardened her soul, only achieves solace in her true love. While humanity that is based in reality faces its own tragedies and traumas, these issues that plague her cannot be resolved or escaped by simply falling in love. To quote Freud, men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved and who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. The exchange between Amelia and Gabriele is undoubtedly beautiful, but the audience was easily seduced by the fantasy, ignoring the aggressive drive and orchestrating the idealistic. The tender story about father reunited with daughter, lover enchanted by lover, and political leader pacifying country that the opera presents is spotted with moments of aggression that give a glimpse into reality. It is in these moments that the opera becomes relevant to the aggressive man. The great scene reflecting political strife that was added in Verdi's revision of the opera is the most significant example of the aggression that parallels the audience's reality. The scene opens with great anxiety and leads into a dramatic exchange between patricians, plebeians, the Doge, and his men. This scene expresses the great power that man can draw on through his aggressive drive. The heightened language and short chants evoke powerful emotion that political change is ensuing and that this is a pivotal moment for the society. At long last, there are characters introduced that are not okay with their situations and are willing to take drastic action in order to achieve change. This scene grows more intense with the musical score it is arranged with. The orchestra bravely matches the demonstrative crowd's sentiments. Then there is a sudden change in the music, a softer, quieter, more suspicious-sounding melody. On an abortive mission, the Doge enters again and, at an alarmingly rapid pace, is able to placate the angry mob. The Doge is effective in his mission only because the language he utilizes is appeasing yet authoritative. He masterfully puts everyone in their place by demeaning them in their mere squabbles and enforcing that they must be better than that they must be worth peace and love. He does not speak too grandiosely or make himself too superior, but rather attempts to unify his country through strong encouragement and brief but powerful statements. Aggression is raw emotion and needs to be appreciated as the driving force of man. The inclination that man has towards aggression cannot be ignored as the opera would like. Major political strife and discontent cannot be resolved by merely asking for peace and love as the Doge did. It is absurd that those words alone would be enough. The language of the opera is so emotional and evocative, but it is in the scenes such as the council scene where that emotion goes too far and becomes too detached from reality. The words become fantasy and the situation comes across as not being genuine. While the language should be revered for its eloquence and beauty, it should be scorned for going over the top. Verdi's Boccanegra is too beautiful, too easily resolved, and too romantic. The language, which is derived as much from the lyrics as it is from the music, exhibits a perfection that man can never reach. The only sections of the opera that created a sense of it being real and attainable were the few moments that exhibited characters being aggressive. While these moments were short-lived, they matter to the audience and present a glimpse of realism in a sea of fanaticism. Reality would be incredibly boring and monotonous were it modeled after the opera. There is an inherent need of civilization to face conflict, and man is uncomfortable without aggression. Conflict needs to brew, and aggression must be acted upon. The tale of Simone Boccanegra would have been much different had the aggressive moments been allowed to surpass the sweet moments of love and romance in magnitude. That would have been a fairer representation of reality and man's tendencies towards aggression. Despite Freud's lack of evidentiary proof, his argument is both valid and sensible. Why would something that is so intrinsic, like aggression, require proof? Certain aspects of man are inexplicably innate. In simple terms, aggression and conflict are merely pieces of man that create the type of civilization that he desires. Squelching that drive is only prolonging the inevitable and forbidding the reality of life from breaking the mold of fantasy. His ideas do not require proof because of that intrinsic quality. The opera would claim that it is love, not aggression, which is intrinsic to man. It would be understood that something so magnificent as love in the fantasy of opera would need no proving. Lovers must only love each other. There is no way that the opera characters can prove their love to one another. They can express their loving feelings only through song, beautiful language, and romantic gestures, but that is the extent. In the same regard, the opera would claim that love cannot be proven. It is understood that aggression needs no proof and that it is a natural outburst of man that needs expressing. Reality is not a tragically beautiful opera. Reality is not the intoxicating nature of the Italian language through song. Reality is not easily remedied. If only everything could be remedied with the singing of a delicate aria and the composition of heavenly music, and if only our lives could be set to the soundtrack of our choosing, pairing each of the awful, crazy, loving, great, scary, bold moments in life with the appropriate musical number. But that is too simple and too idealistic for the aggressive world that man faces every day. While opera is incredibly beautiful and an enjoyable theatrical experience, it functions as an escape rather than as a relevant narrative of society. The tragedies, reunions, and resolutions are all romantic, while the real world exhibits little romance but great conflict and aggression. What Freud understands about man's aggressive drive must be applied to life as well as art. If art does not encompass the inherent features that make man, then audience will drift away from productions like operas, finding them inaccessible and too distinct from their own world.
And the division of the human psyche into the id, ego, and superego. However, if you were to read his books that contain less of an emphasis on his discredited ideas, such as Civilization and Discontents, you may better understand why Freud won the Goethe Prize, a prestigious German literary award, in 1930. At the end of Civilization and its Discontents, Freud apologizes for his poor writing skills, which comes as a surprise because of how powerful his writing is throughout his book. Freud taps into the people's experiences and uses powerful language to make his views more appealing to his readers. Freud's most easily accepted ideas are his ones about love. He claims that at the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and the object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were fact. Anyone who has experienced love, or at least approached the feelings of it, easily understands how true the statement is. The kind of love where a man is prepared to behave as if he and his mate were one is usually dreamt about and rarely obtained because of how loosely the word love is used. People may think they have been in love before, but when two people are truly in love, they feel as if the world is complete. Their search for the perfect mate is finally over, which brings about a level of happiness that is rarely obtainable by other means. Freud describes this level of happiness as the climax of the love relationship and says that there is no room left for any interest in the environment. A pair of lovers are sufficient to themselves and do not even need the child they have in common to make them happy. In life, people strive for happiness. Each choice a person makes is typically based around the happiness they feel they will obtain as a result of their decision or the suffering they would feel they will avoid. Freud uses the child, the one living thing that requires the existence of each parent in order to itself exist, to show just how powerful love is. In fact, love is very dangerous because it opens people up to an opportunity of extraordinary happiness with a possibility of extreme suffering. Freud claims that we are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love, never so helplessly unhappy as when we have lost our loved object or its love. At one point or another, the average person will experience losing a loved object or its love, or the love it gave. The people who experience the loss are typically overwhelmed with a wave of depression, the likes of which they have never experienced before. To help describe just how overwhelming it can be to lose a loved one or its love, Freud uses repetition of the word never. Never is a statement of absolute certainty that does not allow room for argument. The word typically prevents people from arguing because it assures them that there would be no reason to consider alternative thoughts, and therefore becomes a very powerful tool in any argument. However, if used loosely, never can easily become the definite argument as well, due to its utter certainty. In this case, Freud's repetitive cadence shows his use of powerful language. When people lose love in their life, it is common for them to feel as though they will never be happy again, and people usually feel confused because they knew that life could be, because they never knew that life could be so cruel. After a period of grieving, the feeling of being lost in life usually dissipates, and people continue their search for others they can share their love with. The only sound conclusion for such interesting behavior seems to be that love's chief function, favored in every way by nature, is the preservation of the species. Freud is extremely convincing through his use of repetition, as well as stating ideas that are shared among the majority of people. He uses love, a feeling that nearly every person of a mature age understands, to connect with others, and then builds upon his basic conclusions to help support his later ones. He also uses phrases like favored in every way by nature to make statements that seem irrefutable and therefore avoid argument. This phrase contains another absolute every, which makes him seem more certain in his argument and therefore makes the average reader more inclined to agree with him. Just as love is essential for the preservation of the species, guilt is essential for civilization and humanity. Guilt triggers feelings of wrongdoing within individuals which condition them to do the right thing. Without guilt, people would not feel ashamed when they cause harm to others, and laws would lose the power to prevent people's wrongdoings. Freud describes the sense of guilt as the tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it, which expresses itself as a need for punishment. The feeling of guilt is shared among most human beings. Guilt is such a strong driving force that it has caused people who have committed crimes to confess even when their confessions mean they will experience the most severe punishments. As Freud puts it, civilization therefore obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for self-aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it. Starting at an early age, people are told what is morally right and wrong, and are punished accordingly. The first origin of the sense of guilt arises from the fear of an authority, punishing the individual. Once the individual begins to mature, bad luck seems to be caused solely by the individual, which brings about the second origin of guilt. When a man is unfortunate, he searches his soul, acknowledges his sinfulness, heightens the demands of his consciousness, imposes abstinences on himself, and punishes himself with penances, according to Freud. The use of long lists to support his argument is another method that Freud uses to enhance his declarations. When people are faced with lists, they get the impression that there are not nearly as many things they could say in opposition, and thus tend to more readily agree with the original statement. In this case, many people would also agree because they have experienced similar stages of guilt where they have punished themselves as well. The subconscious punishment people induce upon themselves may be seen as a defense mechanism, as it causes people to avoid similar actions that made them feel guilty in the first place. For example, people will be deterred from lying if the act of lying makes them feel guilty. Overall, guilt is a large contributor to the human unhappiness, and yet it is the one thing that ensures people can live together. Freud intends to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization, and to show that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. Providing the reader with a solid background on his beliefs about guilt and summing up his beliefs with his initial intentions makes Freud's views more agreeable. When people are eased into new ideas, they are more likely to accept them because they are presented with evidence that supports the one side or the other. The ability to make an argument is dependent upon the words people use as well as how the words are arranged and presented. Freud successfully uses a wide range of techniques, including repetition and powerful wording, to defend his ideas throughout civilization and its discontents. He takes many views that seem as though they are common sense and uses them to support his theories, thereby giving his readers something to relate to. In turn, his arguments become more convincing, and therefore, Freud is able to gain more support for his ideas.
The ins and outs of the mind. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud explores the internal drives that determine our behavior as human beings. In the completion of his scientific project, Freud uses various sources to back up his ideas. Although critics state that the mixing of science and other disciplines is not a suitable way to prove concepts, other readers view this manner of explanation to be good. Freud's scientific project is enhanced by his use of various disciplines, due to it making his ideas more attainable and understandable to a wider audience. The first point in the book in which Freud departs from the psychoanalytic realm is in his explanation of the oceanic feeling of eternity. Before he breaks away, he explains that it is not always possible to scientifically deal with feelings, that emotions cannot always be measured physiologically, and when these ideas hold true, then a person must rely on associations to get as close as they can to giving content to an idea. His point is reasonable and makes sense. Freud describes the oceanic feeling of eternity as a young child's experience of oneness with the world. Stepping aside from the scientific realm, Freud explains this feeling with the historical reference of the eternal city. He tells his readers of the various inhabitants of the cities and city structures that have filled what was originally the Roma Quadrata, as time has passed. He then goes further and asks his readers to imagine that all these earlier settlements, up to modern-day Rome, that at some point filled the Quadrata, all exist as physical entities in the same area at once. This imagery exercise pushes the reader to try to create a pictorial view. Due to the impracticality of this task, the reader contrastingly recognizes that only so little of an overall spectrum of history can be present in a space at a single time. Furthermore, we can draw out the idea that just because something isn't there in the present doesn't mean it didn't happen or matter. It's still important. Thus, we find the analogy to be effective. Not only did it bring a visual representation of an idea, but also it simplifies our frame of focus. By having the reader narrow in on a single location over the spectrum of history, as opposed to all of civilization and its various components, Freud is able to grab his reader's attention and actually have them comprehend his psychoanalytic thoughts. This first example sets the groundwork for Freud's explanation of how people represent the characteristics of the mind in an illustrative manner. From this, Freud expands to memory retrieval to help additionally develop his explanation of the oceanic feeling of eternity. The fact remains that only in the mind is such a preservation of all earlier states alongside the final form possible, and that we are not in a position to represent this phenomenon in pictorial terms. Although we cannot remember everything that we have experienced at any moment in our lives, we are able to retrieve our experiences when similarities or cues are present to bring them to the surface. Although the whole spectrum of the past cannot be viewed in a single instance, an event's overall contribution to the past still serves a purpose in history up to current times. The overall idea of this oceanic feeling is that we are part of history, and we are therefore connected to the whole story that makes up eternity. We begin our lives not knowing what we are personally and separately. We see ourselves as part of a whole, without a sense of self. As we mature, we develop egos, and therefore mentally astray from this connection. But when one experiences the oceanic feeling, Then, for a moment, one places his or herself back in the external realm of an all-encompassing existence. In this romantic take on the oceanic feeling, Freud's scientific project is strengthened. Despite not using experimental data to prove a point, Freud's use of history and a physiological example make his explanation of the ego and the experience of the oceanic feeling more universal. Freud recognizes the difficulty of understanding the mind on pictorial terms, and therefore uses examples outside of his field of psychoanalysis to help explain his concepts. Most people can understand history in the recollection of memories without having a psychology background, and therefore it is a good way to explain the intricate concept of ego. Another point in the novel, when Freud breaks away from scientific data to explain his ideas, is in his explanation of guilt. In order to understand the sources of guilt, Freud first explains the concept of the superego. The superego is a sort of internal check system that every individual obtains as they develop a sense of self, ego, and mature to adults. The superego regulates the actions of the ego in the form of a conscience, and consequently imposes a sense of guilt and intrinsic self-punishment on the individual. Freud then proceeds by stating that there are two sources of guilt, one arising from fear of authority, and other, later on, arising from a fear of the superego. With these two sources revealed, Freud is making the point that prior to the installation of the superego, an individual's sense of guilt is simply what he or she is held accountable for by a higher authority. Once the superego is fixed in an individual, it omnisciently regulates his or her thoughts and deeds, as well as his and her actions. Largely, not only the performance of a bad action, but also the thought of a bad action is regulated by the superego, bringing about a sense of guilt in the individual. Freud then describes the Oedipus complex to continue his explanation of the function of the superego in invoking guilt. This example explains to the reader the authority to which humans' regression is renounced. We cannot get away from the assumption that man's sense of guilt springs from the Oedipus complex and was acquired at the killing of the father by the brothers banded together. On that occasion, an act of aggression was not suppressed, but carried out. But it was the same act of aggression whose suppression in the child is supposed to be the source of his sense of guilt. From this added example, the reader further understands the internal authority of the superego accounts for the guilt one experiences as a matured person. A guilty action does not need to be carried out for one to feel guilt. Simply the thought of such an action will cause a person to experience guilt. Although this psychoanalytic term was explained with a non-psychoanalytic approach, the reader still finds the concept of the Oedipus complex bringing about guilt to be believable and comprehensible. Also, by the inclusion of the phrase, "we cannot get away from," the idea of guilt is internalized. It's as if Freud himself is pressing guilt upon the readers. This subtle demonstration suggests that the feeling of guilt is inescapable due to the fear of the consequences that ignorance of our actions can evoke. In total, although some critics argue that the inclusion of non-empirical data detracts from Freud's scientific project, it can really be a source of strength. The inclusion of various disciplines contributes to the explanation and universality of non-visual and difficultly tangible concepts. By including examples external to the psychoanalytic realm, Freud is able to simplify the complex concept of the mind and make it understandable to a wider audience. Moreover, the science of psychology is about supporting ideas, not proving them. A psychologist's goal is to show empirically that there are very low probabilities of something occurring by chance, and therefore they can conclude there is a strong relationship between one thing and another. Concluding causation is not their goal. They're trying to conclude a strong sense of theory. Once that foundation is established, they can build off that and draw more connections. Overall, Freud's essay was comprised on the scientific principles of an experiment, but its structure was elastic enough to accommodate both empirical and theoretical evidence. Both types of evidence contributed in relevant and supportive ways to his scientific concepts. By integrating references to literature, history, and theoretical studies, Freud is able to stay true to the broadness of the mind explored in the essay while still being experimental in nature.
Hi everyone, thank you all for coming.
My paper is too long to read in its entirety, so I'm going to be skipping somewhat. I'm skipping most of the close readings I do, which I know Daniel will love, since that's the point of this course. And I have a cold, so I'm sorry. So I'm just going to start, and if it feels like it skips, it's because it does. This is titled Remembering the South. How do we remember the South? From past the Mason-Dixon line to the tip of Florida's Keys, stretching westward into Louisiana and Arkansas, how has the Southern reality been constructed? While the cultural legacy itself is tied to geographic locations, Southern heritage has been constructed to cover much wider terrain. Inherent in this cultural legacy is the assumption of white privilege, but, as is the case across the nation, we frequently opt not to vocalize this, thus constructing our own version of history. This paper examines two constructions of the Southern reality by tracing how society has been asked to remember the South. The first source, a Civil War-era diary written by Mary B. Chestnut, asks readers to graciously remember the dominant genteel Southern culture as separate from oppressive white privilege. The second myriad of sources forms a current-day construction of remembrance, the discourse surrounding the Trayvon Martin shooting. Mary Chestnut's diary is misleadingly titled. Though it is Mary Boykin's Chestnut's diary from 1860 to 1865, the word diary lulls readers into a false sense of security. Mary Chestnut is actually an unreliable narrator, having edited her diary before publication as well as self-consciously censoring herself. She was writing for an audience from the beginning and even describes taking pleasure in sharing her writings with others. The word diary makes her writing seem personal and raw, but does not account for the manipulation that all writers are granted. As such, readers today can treat the text as a historical document, but must be aware of the level of artifice in her language. Perhaps the most striking conclusion that she makes while writing is that she aligns the subservient South to Pharaoh's slaves, and I'll get into that. Here's the skipping. So she sets up this paragraph where all of a sudden the South has become basically slaves to the North. And so to conclude this defense of the South, Chestnut ends this particular paragraph with a stunning comparison. She writes, "As with the Egyptians, so it shall be with us. If they let us go, it must be across a Red Sea, but one made of blood." So to justify the South's dedication to the Civil War, Chestnut has aligned the Southern upper class with Pharaoh's slaves. It's an absolutely astronomically ridiculous metaphor, but it's not without a grain of merit. We are a nation built off the backs of slavery, and slavery in the South did provide a foundation for much of the North's industry. And this is what Chestnut is asking us to remember. She's asking us to remember that it's more complicated than just racist, oppressive white slave owners in the South and the North who are fighting for this noble cause of freeing the slaves. It was more complicated than that. It was about states' rights. She also doesn't admit her own blatant racism and doesn't admit her own, that she is participating in this oppressive culture. So Chestnut knows that slavery is dying out, and she even writes that it must end. It is her intention, though, that the Southern genteel culture is not recognized as the sole proponent of the barbarism of slavery. Chestnut's cleverness with words and educated references to the Bible aid her construction of the South as a graceful and civil culture. Her drama in the conclusion of this paragraph is indicative of Southern pride at its best. If the readers have not yet been swayed to her side, then they had better be ready to defend themselves. Okay, so what? A woman who was part of high society in the South at the time of the Civil War wanted to defend her culture. Why is this important to us today? Mary B. Chestnut's diary is an attempt to construct the Southern reality, and through the artifice and content of her language, she asks readers to grant the South a gentle and heroic history. We cannot expect her to condemn the institution of slavery or to recognize her own blatant racism, but we can be educated readers and watch the ways in which she pushes us towards her side. When Chestnut draws similarities between slaves and the Southern men who owned them, she is blurring what was an extremely distinct boundary between whites and blacks. She is claiming a certain reality, remembering a history in such a way that it becomes consumable and easier to understand. Still though, why is this important? To answer that question, I would like to direct us to Sanborn, Florida, which coincidentally is about 2 hours south from where I grew up. So you can tell there's some personal bias in this paper. So on February 26, 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was shot and killed by local neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman. Zimmerman had been following Martin after calling 911 to support suspicious behavior. Martin had been headed back to his father's fiance's house after buying snacks at a convenience store. There was a confrontation between the two men which ended with Martin's death, but police officers did not arrest Zimmerman because they could not disprove his claim that the shooting had been in self-defense, which is within Florida's law. Most people following the news can attest to the convoluted story that has since risen. Although continued investigation by higher-ups has revealed that the Sanford police did not properly investigate the shooting, much of the discourse about this issue has consisted of various constructions of Zimmerman's and Martin's characters. Zimmerman's representations have flexed from a white, burly vigilante to a Hispanic man who was severely beaten and feared suffering from brain damage. Martin has been portrayed as a teenager who was an average student and spent his free time volunteering, as well as a delinquent who was suspended from school for drug possession. Photos of the two men have only complicated their constructed personas. Trayvon appears to have a sweet, boyish face, and then we find out that these photos were taken a few years ago. Zimmerman, as anyone would, looks like a criminal in his orange jumpsuit. As these simplified constructions of people have been created, we have been asked to remember a similarly simplified history that favors one side or the other, Zimmerman or Martin. More importantly, these constructions of Zimmerman and Martin overshadow the role of white privilege in this case. We are asked to remember racism and racial profiling as part of the story, but not to critically engage with a system that allowed for these circumstances. Zimmerman claimed his actions were within Florida law and was therefore not arrested. If a white teenager had been shot, though, an initial arrest would have likely been made, or at least a thorough investigation would have been carried out. The policemen assigned to this case were comfortable in assuming that white privilege would take care of the situation and that they needn't contact Martin's girlfriend, who was talking to him at the phone at the time of the confrontation, or contact Martin's family as soon as the body had been identified. They assumed that no one would care when another black boy dies, especially one wearing a hoodie and carrying iced tea. In this case, they bargained wrong. We do care, and for once, the media did notice. The policemen were relying on a discourse that upheld the power establishment of white privilege. Mary Chestnut, though she was on the losing side of the Civil War, asks her readers to disregard the same power establishment, as if it were inconsequential. But the grace and gentleness she ascribes to the Southern identity goes hand in hand with the oppressive and discriminatory power structure that the police relied on. The officers asked us to remember a constructed reality as well, one that wouldn't find their handling of the investigation as faulty. And this is why we cannot allow Chestnut's writing to sway us. The history of white privilege is not unique to the South, but we cannot choose what elements of the past we remember. When Chestnut aligns the rebel cause to Pharaoh's slaves, she is acting the same way that the police officers did. She is selecting what history to tell, just as the police officers constructed their version of the case when they didn't meaningfully probe Zimmerman's defense. We cannot make history consumable, just as Mary Chestnut attempted to while constructing her version of the Southern reality. The media discourse surrounding the murder of Trayvon Martin has done the same thing, and in attempting to simplify the situation, the discourse has not allowed for a meaningful conversation about white privilege to emerge. In this way, the police officers originally assigned to the shooting have almost succeeded in covering up what might be the true complicator or maybe even perpetrator of this case, which is white privilege. Thank you.
The title of my paper is Rhetorically Speaking. Although many criticisms have been placed against Karl Marx and the content of his writing, the rhetoric remains extremely thought-provoking and appropriate to the audience he is writing for, even well over 100 years later. The brilliance of his writing with Engels carried the Communist Manifesto in a way which the similar Grundrisse was not able to be carried. Both works contain very complex concepts. The Grundrisse, in fact, was written with the intent of further explaining the reasoning behind the Communist Manifesto. Both showcase the range of possibilities Marx has in terms of rhetoric. Thus, in comparing the two, we are able to see the range of voices that Marx and Engels are capable of writing in, and ultimately, this serves to show the brilliance of the call to arms at the end of the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels realized that society very clearly had problems. However, changing the status quo is not simple and requires fairly coherent argumentation skills. Marx and Engels employed a number of different rhetorical techniques in order to get their point across and eventually have a call to arms. The final statement of the Communist Manifesto is perhaps the most famous. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletariats have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. This proclamation sticks with the readers, not just because it is a final call to arms, but because it was written so skillfully. They use a very colorful and vivid language, especially with the words tremble and chains, both of which create a very clear picture. There is a real sense of excitement with they have a world to win, and then the final sentence rings with defiance. Thus, these last few sentences are so striking, the reader can't help but want to rise up and unite against the evils perceived of capitalists and win the world for themselves. Of course, before getting to the end and the final call to arms, Marx and Engels have to explain just what communism is, why anyone would want to choose it, and how it differs from other forms of socialism. Their use of rhetoric is no less compelling during these explanations, despite not being a real call to arms until the end. One of the particularly skillful things they do is address the reader as you. After leading the reader through a description of property, they write, "What you see clearly in the case of ancient property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property." Here, they take apart the counter-arguments about property and put them through the lens of history, and challenge the reader to see that their current property is exactly like ancient property. This use of you, which occurs many times throughout the manifesto, almost creates a sense of informality, as if they are sitting down with the reader and explaining to them these arguments very carefully. Yet at the same time, it also clearly establishes the superiority of knowledge on this topic, so the use of you could just as easily be seen as them talking down to the reader and explaining the way that the world works. At times, this explanation even borders on sarcastic as they pick apart the counterarguments. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To that crime, we plead guilty. Although sarcasm is very dismissive, it works very well given all of the things that even at the time they wrote about the manifesto were already counter-arguments to it. Those same counter-arguments are still being made today, so apparently they had a very clear sense of what things would be launched against them. Since they were trying to change the status quo, in some ways the sarcasm works very well. It forces people to examine the things they take for granted, such as this discussion of child labor, and consider them. So if at first the reader is angry that they would suggest such things, at least they have had a reaction. And if that reaction makes them think, and then in thinking, hopefully the reader will reevaluate the situation. Of course, these are just a few examples of the ways in which Marx and Engels try to entice the reader to throw off the chains of capitalism. But these examples highlight the skillful ways in which Marx and Engels use language to get their point across. These three examples come up at different times throughout the manifesto, so they prove a good picture of the kind of rhetoric that's employed. Thus, by the time the reader has finished and seen the use of you numerous times, the use of sarcasm, and the very colorful language that clearly illustrates the use of change. At the same time, it isn't as if the entirety of their thought is based purely on rhetoric. Although Engels did not help to write the Grundrisse, these notebooks by Marx show just how much thought is put into the ideas laid out in the manifesto. The most striking difference between the manifesto and the Grundrisse is the style in which they are written. While the manifesto uses very colorful language and is clearly a call to arms, the Grundrisse is trying to explain the reasoning and reads much more like a scholarly work. The passage which seems to be at the very heart of Marx's argument reads, "No matter that for the worker, the exchange between capital and labor, whose result is the price of labor, is a simple exchange. As far as the capitalist is concerned, it has to be a non-exchange. He has to obtain more value than he gives. Looked at from the capitalist side, the exchange must not only be apparent, i.e. must belong to an economic category rather than exchange, or capital is capital and labor is labor in opposition to it would be impossible." The structure of these sentences here are longer and more drawn out than in the manifesto. Rather than constructing sentences that are meant to entice the reader, here Marx wishes to explain the relationship between capital and labor. The writing is almost dry because the intent is so different. He goes from a very long sentence to a very short sentence to a very long sentence, and that variation is rather consistent throughout the Grundrisse. Although it does lend itself to the informative nature of this work, it also makes part of the Grundrisse seem almost convoluted and difficult to follow. The reader has to look back over many sentences multiple times to fully grasp the meaning. It could be argued that this is due to the difficult nature of the topic, but at the same time, the writing in the manifesto also suggests these difficult concepts, and it breaks them down in a way that is not only straightforward, but also compelling. It would be interesting to know if this was due to Engels' influence in writing the manifesto, or because Marx just had a very different intent in writing the Grundrisse. Either way, the difference in style helps to illustrate just how good the two of them are at using rhetoric in the manifesto, as it explains very similar topics with a kind of panache. Returning to the passage, however, the reader also can get a glimpse of the thought process that is written out in the Grundrisse. Marx uses a style here that is almost as if he were sitting down at a table and explaining this, which may be why the sentences do seem a bit longer, as if they have the feel of a spoken conversation. His use of IE to further explain what he is saying, while elongating the sentence, helps to clear up things in a way someone having a conversation might also do. This isn't to say there's no rhetorical worth to the Grundrisse, just that Marx's writing here is extremely different to the way it is in the manifesto, and it seems, in some ways, almost less accessible, and certainly less powerful in terms of rallying a public. Ultimately, however, neither work is without merits of its own. Both are trying to accomplish very different goals and seem to achieve them surprisingly well, considering what they are arguing for is a complete change of the status quo. The Grundrisse provides the basis for the arguments in the Communist Manifesto by using an almost conversational yet informational way of explaining things, whereas the manifesto is definitely a call to arms. Marx is very capable of using both styles to his advantage, and his ability to do so conveys the brilliance with which he is capable of writing.
Anyone have any questions?
I have a question for Mary.
Now we'll have Amanda Sawyer presenting her paper titled The Scientist and the Philosopher. The Scientist and the Philosopher. What do particle physics and philosophy have in common? Sounds like the start to a bad joke. Less in the degree of separation. Lisa Randall and Aristotle have a strikingly similar method to study their respective subjects. While Randall may be a particle physicist who lives in the present, and Aristotle may be a philosopher who lived centuries ago, they both gravitate toward the direction that the scientific approach provides to their respective fields. Lisa Randall's book, Knocking on Heaven's Door, attempts to examine how physics and scientific thinking illuminate the universe in the modern world, while Aristotle tries to convey the nature of poetry in the Poetics. Essentially, Aristotle and Randall are teachers, bringing abstract concepts to others. In Aristotle's analysis of poetry, he uses a scientific approach to achieve his aim at quantifying the nature of poetry. His study is very systematic. He demonstrates the aims of his investigation in his declaration, "I propose to treat of poetry in itself, in its various kinds, noting the essential quality of each, to inquire into the structure of the plot as a requisite to a good poem, into the number and nature of the parts of which a poem is composed, and similarly into whatever else falls within the same inquiry." He employs observation first, and then attempts to provide explanation and hypothesis about poetry. For example, while Aristotle is discussing the derivatives of poetry, he states, "Since the objects of imitation are men in action, and these men must be either of higher power or lower type, for moral character mainly answers to these divisions, goodness and badness being the distinguishing marks of moral differences, it allows that we must represent men either as better than in real life or as worse, or as they are." He offers two premises that lead to his conclusion, or hypothesis, that men should be represented as good or evil. He observes the world around him, which provides generalizing data to analyze and produce the hypothesis that man can only be represented as good or bad, evil or moral. His scientific approach to the world of poetry is directed in its analysis, but hindered by it as well. Aristotle employs his scientific approach to recommend and hypothesize about the art and creation of poetry. The scientific approach is a useless term if there is a misconception about the interpretation of the commonly employed technique. According to Lisa Randall, the methods scientists use today are the latest incarnation of a long history of measurements and observations that have been developed over time to verify and, as importantly, rule out scientific ideas. Essentially, the scientific approach is acquiring knowledge through the observation of and experience to develop hypotheses and laws correlated with probabilities that are observed in those observations and experiences. Aristotle's method of observation and hypothesis is very restrictive. He is trying to explain something in which language cannot fully express on its own. Additionally, his scientific approach toward poetry is one that contains art into a box. It leaves no room for innovation and creativity. The Poetics reads as a laundry list of what poetry is and what category it falls under. The scientific approach relies on finding law-like behavior that can be reproduced and have the same desired outcome that underlies the phenomena observed. Poetry is not derived in the same way that science is justified, but Aristotle tries to characterize it as the same process. In his definitions, there is no room for creativity or innovation, no room for new definitions when they run together into a mix of comedy and tragedy. A key difference between Randall and Aristotle in explaining is that Aristotle leaves room for improvement while science and physics is always leaves little room for improvement while science and physics is always building on its ideas to improve them. Randall even says, science is not a passive comprehension and belief, and truth about the universe is an end in itself. Scientists actively approach the door to knowledge, the boundary of the domain of what we know. Essentially, Aristotle provides unbreakable laws that are asserted from the intention that they cannot be edited or amended to fit current innovation. For example, his assertion, the same distinction marks off tragedy from comedy. For comedy aims at representing men as worse, tragedy as better than in actual life. His assertion is helpful when evaluating common genres of art, but he does not provide the possibility of ideas that are in gray area, neither black nor white, neither good nor bad. His conjecture in this statement, however, is helpful in alluring the audience of his instruction to side with his teachings. Further, Aristotle and Randall are similar in the approach they employ for analysis. The observation and knowledge of probability is an important concept for both. They make similar assessments in statements about the importance of probability in the scientific approach of their respective fields. Aristotle says, it is moreover evident from what has been said that it is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. Meanwhile, Randall emphasizes science generally settles issues with some degree of probability. Science makes models in which an expected outcome can be derived from a set of probabilities. These models represent law-like behavior in the universe that can be measured and weighed. Aristotle attempts to provide a model of poetry and tragedy in the Poetics in the same way. Thus, he needs to point out that probability is a large factor in the creation of poetry that is the model for good poetry. Peculiarly, Aristotle follows his attention on probability in declaring, the poet and the historian differ not by writing in verse or in poetry. Randall could almost argue that his historian could be replaced with scientist. Science relies heavily on probabilities and measurements to predict future outcomes. Randall says in regards to science, familiarity and comfort with statistics and probability help when evaluating scientific measurements, not to mention many of the difficult issues of today's complex world. In turn, Randall's title of a scientist can be substituted as historian. Scientists must learn from past theories and failures to know the right course for future experimentation. If a poet is comparable to a historian, and a scientist is comparable to a historian, then a scientist can be a poet and a poet a scientist. They may study different aspects of the universe, but they essentially partake in the same practices. For example, a scientist creates experiments to mimic the real world in a controlled environment to observe probabilities of the universe. A poet mimics the universe to create a story which follows the probabilities of the universe. There are limitations to this idea. As Aristotle commits to his scientific analysis, it loses the creativity of what poetry possesses. If every one of his laws of poetry is always employed, then the poetry does not advance. Conversely, A certain amount of creativity is infused into particle physics for this reason, to advance the knowledge. Randall explains the differences between bottom-up and top-down as a means of explaining scientific strategy. She explains the bottom-up approach starts with what is known from experiments and then addresses residual, puzzling, unexplained features, while top-down theories refer to the theoretical notion that everything can be derived from fundamental premises defined as high energy scales. These ideas are contradictory in one another, but they are two separate ways to get to the same place. A certain amount of creativity is necessary for the development in our understanding of the world, both in poetry and in physics. Throughout, Aristotle and Randall maintain a style that is designed to profess these intellectual and philosophical ideas and turn them into a piece that can inform and teach. The Poetics is not a book that Aristotle wrote. However, it is notes, perhaps in many cases lecture notes compiled for his own use or the use of his students. Randall's book, Because Science is Turning to the Task at Hand, explaining what it is that makes this such an exciting and unprecedented era for particle physics and cosmology, is meant to make physics more accessible to the public so that information can be appreciated on a larger scale. Aristotle's and Randall's presentation of abstract ideas is scientific and methodical. While effective in the generation of clear information, it is lacking in its aim. Aristotle sought to provide definitive answers on the nature of poetry, but ended up making it easier to overturn his premises and fall short of encompassing the entire art form that is poetry. Randall attempts to provide real-world examples to accommodate the unconditioned mind to the nature of physics. However, her examples sometimes fall short and are reduced through the course of her piece. As a result, Randall's intended audience, or a person who is unfamiliar with the realm that is particle physics, is lost in a sea of terminology, losing the course to understanding. Additionally, Aristotle loses his credibility when he makes generalizing observations about the world as data for his hypotheses about something that can never fully be explained, as language will always fail in its description. To fully appreciate the arguments and cruxes of each point, the communication through scientific thought and the communication of the experience of poetry is more applicable in previous understanding of each than words that can ever express and explain. Aristotle and Randall have made valiant attempts, but they have failed where language fails because explanation is more difficult than understanding.
The title of her paper is Analogies, Analogies, Analogies. Metaphor and analogy are often used to explain and convey ideas when mere dictionary definitions will not sufficiently do the job. Analogies are representations of the unknown world in terms of the known. However, not all analogies are equal, and they all have a different purpose. Shakespeare uses them to convey the importance of Antony and Cleopatra, so the audience and readers do not forget that these two people are not just regular lovers. Freud uses analogy to simplify his ideas, which is similar to Randall's use, but differs in what Randall is presenting as verifiable scientific fact, and Freud presents theories that cannot have any proof or disproof brought against them. Analogies are comparisons between one thing and another, usually as a way to convey an idea in terms that another person can understand and appreciate. But that does not necessarily mean that analogy is perfect or capable of explaining every aspect. For example, when trying to explain what a tiger is, you might just say that as a wolf is like a large dog, a tiger is like a large cat. However, some people would immediately think of their pet cat or their pet dog, and the worst thing they've probably done is pee in the carpet. So they may not take into account that wolves and tigers are wild animals that must hunt for their food and have not been domesticated. So this analogy has obvious shortcomings in explaining the sheer power that tigers and wolves have at their disposal, but it does allow for a step in the right direction in understanding just what a tiger is, provided you know what a wolf is in relation to a dog. This imperfect nature of analogies is visible in the writings of Shakespeare, Freud, and Randall, but the limits inherent to analogies do not make them bad. Analogies are merely a stepping stone on the path of understanding. If you take a step in the right direction and are able to understand more complex ideas without the aid of simplistic analogies, then the initial analogy has done its job. Although Shakespeare does not try to explain psychological or scientific fact in his play Antony and Cleopatra, he does use analogy within the dialogue to raise Antony and Cleopatra higher and higher and to add to the grandeur of their being. For example, after the death of Antony, Cleopatra claims that his legs bestrode the ocean, as though he were God and the world was insignificantly small compared to him. Even this metaphor is an imperfect one, because gods have incredible power, and so it is unbelievably hard to comprehend the powers we bestow on them, although we would like to think we do. But gods are said to be omniscient and omnipotent, so their abilities are infinite. As mortal humans, we cannot comprehend just how hard that really is. We look at the stars and feel small, but we always remember that we are just one planet in one solar system in one galaxy. There are more galaxies than we'd ever be able to count, but that is, put simply, just about all we know of the universe. So although the metaphor is an imperfect one because our human minds cannot grasp the full meaning of what it is to be a god, Cleopatra's description is a good stepping stone towards allowing the audience to understand her love, adoration, and her grief. We understand the surface of our world. We can compare the size of the average man to grandness of Earth's oceans, and for a man to cross the ocean in a single stride creates a sense of awe and wonder. It makes all other mere mortals feel small and insignificant compared to the mighty Antony. This is the exact feeling that Cleopatra, and through her, Shakespeare, is trying to convey to the readers and the audience. So although Shakespeare uses analogy or metaphor for dramatic effect and not for conveying ideas in a simpler manner, their imperfections are relevant to understanding that analogies are never capable of explaining every single idea that is trying to be conveyed. Freud also uses analogy to bring his ideas to his readers. However, his are used to simplify what he's saying and bring his ideas into terms his readers may have a better chance of understanding without keeping the dictionary next to them at all times. In Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, he uses an analogy comparing the mind to Rome. Just as Rome has changed over the millennia, with new incarnations of Rome being built over the older layers, which provide a foundation that we will never truly be able to fully expose, our mind is layered. We will never be able to excavate through our mind to find the bare foundations, just as the best information about Rome in the Republican era would only enable the traveler to at the most point out the sites where the temples and public buildings of that period stood. This analogy is extremely imperfect for many reasons. These reasons include the distance the reader is from ancient Rome, making it an analogy that the reader may have a difficult time truly understanding or appreciating, and how the mind is described as being layered fairly evenly across, but we cannot be sure that this is true. Even Freud states that the only justification he has for the use of this analogy is that it shows us how far we are from mastering the characteristics of mental life by representing them in pictorial terms. This means that we really cannot describe the mind pictorially and really understand what it means, but Freud understands the shortcomings of this analogy. Knowing that his analogy has limitations, but using it anyway, conveys to the audience that the mind is extremely complex, but comparing it to an ancient city is still the best and simplest way he has at his disposal. The fact that the Rome analogy falls very short of perfection does not by any means make it a bad analogy. Although not every reader may have a true appreciation of Rome, most people can grasp its basic meaning. Because the analogy is only a stepping stone on the path to understanding, as previously stated, grasping the basic meaning is all that Freud requires of the reader at this point in time. The reader is taking a step in the right direction, and so Freud's next arguments will not feel so foreign, and he can go into slightly more detail without needing to worry about losing or confusing his audience, because we have that basic feel for what the mind is like. Randall presents the complexities of physics in a somewhat simplified manner as a way to explain the scientific world to the layman in Knocking on Heaven's Door. Randall uses many analogies that might not seem applicable, but once the additional information is laid upon the foundation of the analogy, it is obviously the best and simplest. For example, Randall compares the universe to a balloon, saying that imagine the universe as the surface of a balloon. Suppose you had marked 2 points on the balloon surface, and as the balloon blows up, the surface becomes stretched, and those 2 points grow farther apart. This very simple view of the universe is probably the best explanation because most people know what the balloon looks like when it expands and can picture what Randall is saying without too much difficulty.
The audience may be able to understand other ideas Randall discusses, such as the Higgs boson particle and the Large Hadron Collider, which are ideas that would overwhelm the audience that she had not prepared, with very simple analogies that acted as a guide to point us in the right direction. Although Randall's analogy is very effective and simple, even she acknowledges its shortcomings. For example, in explaining the imperfections of her ballooniverse, Randall notes that the points do not actually span, only the space between the points. Also, she made note of the three-dimensional nature of the universe, as well as its infinite size. Be that as it may, readers forgive the imperfections of her comparisons of a matter of something you can make in your kitchen, of the universe being like a staple of any 6-year-old birthday party. It may be an imperfect analogy, but it put down another stone in the path of our understanding, which allows us to keep up with her instead of being overwhelmed and left behind, and that is what counts. In conclusion, there is no such thing as a perfect analogy, but perhaps that is the point. No analogy will ever be able to adequately explain every aspect of an idea, and if someone created one that somehow could, then there wouldn't even be a need for it. The idea may as well be explained by itself without the aid of analogies. Analogies are not only meant to embellish or explain or point the audience in the right direction. Once the writer feels we have had enough guidance, he or she can delve deeper into their topic without the aid of analogies, because the more complex the idea is, the harder it is to find an adequate analogy. Analogies provide a start, and having some understanding of the basic ideas presented by the writer allows us to connect ideas better to the end. Shakespeare, Freud, and Randall then all understood that every analogy has its limits, but they did not want perfection when they were presenting their thoughts. Shakespeare attempted to convey the grandeur of his main characters, Antony and Cleopatra, but he fell short because he was trying to make them equivalent to gods. That kind of power is just too much for mortals to comprehend, and yet the audience can feel Cleopatra's pain at her lover's loss. Freud tried to simplify the complex nature of the mind into something a normal person could understand, so he compared it to the layering of ancient Rome, which was a complicated and troublesome analogy. That did not stop him from using it, though, because a complicated and busy city is so full of history is the best way to encompass as many aspects of the mind as possible. Randall, who was trying to simplify the ideas of particle physics and the nature of the universe by using a balloon, did not use perfect analogies either. She acknowledged the shortcomings of her analogies, but basic idea of the universe expanding is similar to a balloon, gives us a start and opens up the path of understanding to us. The limitations of analogies are inherent, and they would not be generally accepted without them. An analogy needs to encompass as much of the idea as it can, but the more variables it tries to take into account, the more exceptions present themselves, and the less accepted an analogy may be.
Now I'll present my paper, which is titled Don't Rush the Souffle. Think back to the first and perhaps last basic science course you took, and you might remember how challenging it was to try to understand the properties of an atom, that thing composed of negatively charged electrons orbiting a dense nucleus of positively charged protons and zero-charged neutrons. A task like that requires you to think in abstract ways, because an atom is not something you can see with your eyes or interpret with any of your other senses. In her book, Lisa Randall attempts to defy the boundaries that exist between scientists and non-scientists and bring us closer to the discoveries at hand, as well as reshape our thoughts about what science is. The interesting way in which Randall devises her plan consists of using analogies to explain the nature of physics and the abstract phenomena it entails, and taking detours away from daunting scientific jargon every so often to explore related disciplines. Together, these strategies have a tantalizing effect, because even when we are reduced to considerable confusion and struggling to remember the difference between a quark, a lepton, and a boson, we look forward to the next analogy or detour that may somewhat ease our frustrations. In this manner, Randall's work embodies the sublime nature of the universe, something so wonderful and so frustrating at the same time. The first thing I associate with the word tantalizing is food, and one of Randall's analogies uses food to ease us into the basics of physics. in order to help us see how matter can have different properties and follow different physical laws from the fundamental units of which it is composed. She makes us think about how we can use many ingredients, milk, butter, eggs, flour, that all have different colors, textures, and tastes to make a souffle. Just like matter, a souffle is very different from the ingredients that were combined to make it. As cooks of a souffle, we do not feel as removed from the field of physics as we once were. We were comfortable thinking about ourselves and familiar activities. Randall thus holds off on the more complicated inner workings of physics a little longer and lets us enjoy thinking about ourselves by comparing physics to physiology. She engages us in narratives about the discovery of the clavicle's function upon internal dissection, the eventual understanding of the functions of arteries, veins, and the network of capillaries in the circulatory system, and the molecular structure of our DNA. We delight in the wonders of our body and are ultimately engaged in an explanation of how physics is concerned with descending deeper and deeper into smaller and smaller units of the atomic scale. Randall's narrative makes physics appear simple enough, and we are ready to dive into whatever she has to say next. Although there is really no way for Randall to use analogies to describe more dry subjects like the construction of the Large Hadron Collider, she still finds a way to insert a few analogies, again with an emphasis on ourselves, to explain certain topics. One of the most notable analogies would be her comparison of the manner in which radio waves pulse the protons to a higher energy, the way you push a child on a swing. The first push only moves the swing a tiny amount, but after multiple pushes, the swing really kicks into gear. Another notable analogy would be Randall's explanation of extra dimensions by having us picture a man walking on a tightrope versus an ant walking on a tightrope. We may not have actually experienced walking on a tightrope before. However, we can imagine that the man might notice only one dimension, straight across, while the ant might experience two, straight across and a curled up one going around the wire. The analogies can be intriguing on their own, yet Randall also inserts little detours from beginning to end that play to our strengths, depending on what non-scientific fields we personally enjoy, while still capturing the essence of science. She distinguishes between art, religion, and science as different means to channel people's curiosity. She gives us the history behind the battle between religion and science, and how both have shaped the way people choose to interpret new observations in the universe. She even stops in the middle of her discussion of the Large Hadron Collider to address cost-benefit analyses associated with the project, which entices those who have an economic background. Probably the greatest surprise is how Randall includes the aspect of artistic appeal to the essence of science, that things that are symmetrical are beautiful, and the best scientific descriptions frequently respect the elegance of symmetric theories. Randall's small detours are intriguing. However, if we are to take anything away from this experience, it would be to consider her larger detour on probability distributions and her assertion that the rules can change as we reach new domains, in order to at least illuminate ourselves on the true definition of science, an evolving body of knowledge. From Copernicus and Galileo to Newton and Rutherford, to Einstein, Planck, and Bohr, and all the scientists in between and of late, it is clear that new ideas are constantly being circulated and tested. Randall does not require us to understand the nitty-gritty details of every scientific inquiry and methodology. In fact, at one point, she comforts us, saying, if you are finding all these details a bit overwhelming, keep in mind that this is more information than even most physicists need to know. However, we get the feeling that she wants us to recognize how much progress scientists have made, despite the universe's inevitable uncertainties. She entertains us with the following story. I was once at a party where I met someone who boldly insisted to me that she didn't believe in science. So I asked her whether she had taken the same elevator to the 11th floor that I had. Did her phone work? How did her electronic invitation reach her? The woman's denial is certainly incredible, But the focus of the story is not to ridicule people. Rather, Randall reveals a greater purpose, to urge people to endorse the intellectual power that science brings, rather than fear, resent, or in the aforementioned woman's case, reject it. Now the word reject ties further into Randall's emphasis on probability distributions, which tell us how likely it is for a set of data to occur by chance, and if we can accept or reject a hypothesis based on a theory. Quantum mechanics involves Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which states that the accuracy with which position of a particle is known limits the maximum precision with which one can measure momentum. Randall therefore explains that probability distributions tell us how likely electrons are to be found in a particular point in space, and these probabilities can be calculated from well-defined laws. Although Randall devotes little time to psychology in her book, with the exception of a brief remark that religion might well yield valuable psychological benefits, the fact that particle physics relies on probability brings to mind the way in which psychological testing is done. Psychology deals with abstract concepts as well, so we must rely on statistics and probability distributions to make decisions. Like physics, psychology is an evolving body of knowledge, and is subject to the same kinds of limitations. What we want to measure cannot necessarily be detected with the human eye, and our conclusions may be subject to falsification in the future. Researchers in physics and psychology alike never cease asking questions about the validity of existing claims. For example, the design of the experiment is always in question, and we must wonder whether we actually measured what we were hoping to measure. Furthermore, if we do detect some difference in nature, we must wonder whether we can generalize it to all situations or not. Randall repeatedly mentions how Newton's laws do not work for all ranges of length, speed, and densities, and that quantum mechanics applies at very small distances, relativity at extremely high speeds, and general relativity at large densities, such as black holes. Of course, in psychology, we would try to generalize behaviors of people in all types of situations, rather than behaviors of particles. We can think of probability distribution as a tool model builders use to investigate research questions in fields like psychology and especially in physics. In Knocking on Heaven's Door, Randall explains that models illustrate imaginative new ideas. And I can't help but think that she tried to make her writing style serve as a model for other scientists trying to spread scientific knowledge to mere lay people. Her use of analogies captures our attention, and the prospect of her explaining another challenging concept with an analogy helps us to power through the portions of the book that we may find to be frustrating and beyond our comprehension. Moreover, she appeals to the interests of many people, taking the time to address history, religion, economics, and art as they relate to physics. Most important, her goal in writing this book is to let us know that we need not know all there is to know about physics to be illuminated. Physicists do not even know all there is to know about physics. That is why there continues to be so much research. There is plenty more to discover, but at least we are aware of the progress science has made up until this particular moment in time, and we are open to learning more about what the universe has in store. And finally, we have Lorenzo Cordova presenting his paper called Creative Outbursts.
Hi, how are you doing? Lisa Randall is a highly accomplished physicist who has published 2 widely accepted books on physics. In late 2010, she published her second book, Knocking on Heaven's Door, in which she attempts to simplify particle physics for a non-physics audience by using analogies and bombastic personal stories. She writes about her experience with the Large Hadron Collider, which is located under the border between Belgium and Switzerland, and the Higgs particle. According to Randall, if the Higgs particle is found, it will be a huge breakthrough for the physics community, and will contribute to the standard. Will be the final contribution to the Standard Model, which is a theory concerning the electromagnetic weak and strong nuclear interactions which mediate the dynamics of the known subatomic particles. And this will be complete once the Higgs particle is found. However, Randall's book is Randall's book is more than just Successful professors, sorry, I lost my plate. However, Randall's book is more than just a successful woman's account of her experience with the Large Hadron Collider and her successes as a professor at such places like Harvard. Randall, towards the end of her book, talks about the Russian author Pushkin and his thoughts on creativity. Her conclusions are essentially that all fields of science must have some sort of creative aspect in order to succeed. Randall writes, creativity is essential to particle physics, cosmology, and mathematics, and to the other fields in science, just as it is in more widely acknowledged beneficiaries, the arts and humanities. If Randall is correct in her assertions, then we are able to find that moment of creativity when an author is able to synthesize ideas and create new striking information. We can call this moment in the work a creative outburst. We will look at the works of Sigmund Freud, Aristotle, and Mary Boykin Chestnut to find their creative outburst. By looking at text from authors from different fields who produce different forms of art, we're able to see that in each field, an author is able to have that creative outburst. When looking at psychoanalytic psychology, Freud is probably one of the most recognized for his work. Is probably most recognized for his work with the id, ego, and superego. According to Freud, the id is innately within us from the time of birth. The ego is essential to our understanding of reality, and the superego holds our entire internalized moral standards that we derive from our parents and society. Freud goes on to say in his latter work that the key for a healthy personality is a balance between the id, the ego, and the superego. This work makes Freud widely known. However, I find that his latter work to be more creative by the standards of Lisa Randall's definition. In his book Civilization and Discontent, Freud makes bold statements in regard to the driving forces in our civilization. At this moment, it's perhaps where he is most creative because he's able to narrow civilization to two drives. Freud's view on the love drive, his first drive, is as follows. The love that founded the family remains effective in civilization, both in its original form, in which direct sexual satisfaction is not renounced, and its modified form as aim-inhibited affection. In both it continues to perform the function of binding together fairly large numbers of people. Freud believed that one of the drives that binds civilizations together is the love-sex drive, the yearning for someone to love you, and the desire for sexual satisfaction. Freud's views on the aggression/destruction drive are as follows. Conversely, any restriction of this outward aggression would be bound to increasingly to a degree of self-destruction. Although these findings are not able to be proven by the modern psychologist community, this is where he is most creative. He is able to narrow civilization to two drives. The fact that both drives are also in constant conflict with one another further shows his creativity. Freud's work has not been proven by the science, Freud is able to psychoanalyze civilization and develop his drives, enabling his creativity to burst. Aristotle's work has transgressed many different books, and he is widely read throughout the world. His philosophy is yet another form of art to be admired. According to a Stanford Encyclopedia, his most popular work is on logic, and more specifically with syllogism. However, his creative outburst can be found in his book called Poetics, in which Aristotle defines, like someone would define a science, tragic plot. He has a clear definition and structure as to what he believes a tragedy should be compiled of. Aristotle writes, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is admirable, complete, and possesses magnitude. In language made pleasurable, each of its species separated in different parts, performed by actors, not through narration, affecting through pity and fear the purification of emotions. This is his definition of tragedy, which he follows by giving us the components of a tragic plot. Aristotle goes on to say that a plot is best when there is completeness, a whole which has a beginning, middle, and end, magnitude, any living object, whether a living organism or an entity composed of parts, must only possess those parts in order. Unity, determinate structure, is the presence of absence of something has no discernible effect. It is not part of the whole, and universality. The poet must be a maker of plots rather than verses. Insofar, he is a poet with respect to imitation, and the object of imitation is action. Now, what is creative in Aristotle's definition of tragedy and his components of tragic plot is he has made the art of imitation rather logical and simple. He has a clear definition of what exactly should be in a tragedy and a tragic plot. Mary Boykin Chestnut can be categorized as a non-fiction creative writer, which is unlike Freud, who was a psychoanalytic psychologist, and Aristotle, who was a philosopher. Her diaries have been widely accepted as accounts from someone who has had status and power during the Civil War, being on the Confederate side. Her diary entries enable us to understand the struggles of privileged women as they become overshadowed by their husband's position in the war. This is perhaps where her creativity thrives, as she is able to make her Civil War diaries into an internal struggle for Southern women who deal with their husband's sudden new role in the Confederate fight. Mary Chestnut writes, "I was walking on Franklin Street when I met my husband. 'Come with me to the War Office for a few minutes,' said he, 'and then I will go home with you.' What could I do but go? He took me up on a dark stairway and then down a long dark corridor and left me sitting in the window, saying he would not be gone a second. He was obliged to go into the Secretary of War's room. There I sat mortal hours. Men came to light the gas. From the first I put down my veil so that nobody might know me. Numbers of persons passed that I knew, but I scarcely felt respectable seated up in that odd way." In a time where women's opinions were suppressed by their husbands, Chestnut struggled. Her use of language and narrative enabled us to understand the gender roles during the Civil War era, and more specifically with the Southern society. Chestnut uses her language to set up the situation and express her emotions. If your husband did not come when he said he did, you wait for him to come back. To obey your husband is a Southern tradition. Leaving without your husband's consideration was not allowed back then, and was highly looked down upon for women to do so. Besides telling her accounts on the Civil War, being on the Confederate side, Chestnut underlies various issues in Southern society, but gender role is most present. The issues with gender roles is most present in her diaries. Her creative outbursts take her diaries from a wealthy woman's account on the Confederate side to the unequal and male-dominated society of the South. As we have seen, there have been differences in forms of art, but creativity is lacking no less. Lisa Randall did well introducing Pushkin's idea of creativity, as we have seen with the well-known philosopher Aristotle, the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, and the epitomizer of a Southern wealthy wife, Mary Boykin Chestnut. Creativity is everywhere and well within those forms of art. There's no perhaps defining moment of when a person is able to become creative, or how it is exactly that a person becomes creative. Creative is that one component in all forms of art that is essential for its existence. To say that you lack creativity is not allowed, and I challenge someone to prove creativity is not within us. As we have seen with some of the best philosophers, a non-fiction creative writer, and analytic psychologist, they have creative outbursts, and so can we. Thank you.
Now we'll have a question and answer session.
I have a question I'll actually work both for Rebecca and for you, Christina. I heard at the beginning of Rebecca's talk about how analogy and metaphor is maybe a way of pushing understanding beyond the dictionary definition. I might be misquoting you, or at least that it's not. It's not what you would find in a, oh sorry, I'm looking at the wrong person. Beyond dictionary definition. And then I was wondering about, like, if you looked at a random 30 words defined in the dictionary, whether you would find analogy or metaphor in the definition itself. So when Christina then said that the way that Randall defines science is an evolving body of knowledge, I guess my question is, to what extent is that definition laden with metaphor, and what then is the consequence of that?
As we were talking, I kind of saw where you were going with that, because as soon as you said evolving body of knowledge, I was thinking
brief mention of her talk about physiology and physics things and learn that sort of thing. So I never thought of the word body as something that would, encompass that. But yeah, that's difficult to say. I was more focused on the evolution aspect of the definition of science rather than a body of knowledge. That is something that is always progressing and new things happening. But
I think people bring their own knowledge to the definitions of things like the science being an evolving body of knowledge, like what people understand of the science colors, like how they see it. And so I don't think having metaphors in that definition is going to do anything. I think it kind of helps because it helps you understand in your own way.
I'll ask a quick follow-up, though it's not really a follow-up. But yeah, to what extent, like, let's say in the process of teaching and learning, is analogy and metaphor simply a almost condescending way of teaching?
I don't think it's condescending because, like, basically what I was saying was that it's a stepping stone. It points you in the right direction because when you're presented with a new idea and you have no idea where to start, if you present something that you do understand and you understand how that relates to other things, then you have some idea of what direction you can go. You have some idea of like where you are starting. So it lays like a foundation for you to build upon.
Although, I mean, rhetorically, doesn't it imply that, let's say, the teacher is saying, you can't know this the way I know it, so let me tell you what it's like.
But I think a student goes into a class knowing that because the teacher has been taught all this for many, many years. And in some instances, this is the first time a student has come across these ideas. So the teacher has to be able to explain it in a way that the student does understand. Not necessarily using ideas that they're trying to teach, but ideas that can be related to, like, just like the balloon being compared to the universe. Like, that's not necessarily what you would think of the first time you think of the universe, but if you're trying to explain the expansion of the universe to somebody and it's so infinite, if you can boil it down that way, it's not condescending, I don't think, unless you like do it over and over and over again, and the person already understands the basics.
I actually mentioned that topic very, very, very briefly in my paper, and what I think is it's harder to like know something and tell someone else about it and try to explain it than it is to understand it. Like, I already understand it, but I don't know how to teach it. So it's almost like a simplification for the teacher more than the student, maybe, because I think it is harder to teach something to someone and explain it in a way that I understand it.
And I think that it is condescending when you try to use analogy and then expect someone to understand that analogy, and then they may lead them in a whole different direction. So I think that it's analogies should be used properly and carefully.
Right, it's a danger.
Yes.
So these scientists are gods, right? And the Higgs boson particle is the God particle. They understand, and the rest of us are just flopping along here.
Well, they've
No, we're
also
reduced to metaphorical understanding, right? This is kind of what I was getting at. We're below, we're being condescended to because we just have a metaphorical understanding of what other people really know.
Well, we haven't been studying this stuff for years and years. We've just read like a book about it that's meant for people that aren't full-time physicists that are looking for this article. She's just trying to explain it to us so that we can have an appreciation of what's going on in our world instead of being totally ignorant.
But my real question is whether scientists do have a deeper understanding of the world than we do. That's, I didn't mean
I think
it to
they
be
just have
so
a different
with.
understanding. That's it. It's not deeper or anything. It's just different.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Rebecca there. I don't think the universe is very complex, and people think about the universe in different terms. In physics, they're thinking about the universe in terms of, particle physics and cosmology and kind of, on this atomic scale. Whereas other people, philosophers, people who are studying theology, they view the universe in different terms. So I don't really think it's necessarily the physicists have a deeper understanding of the universe, but it's just different understanding.
We can also try and examine the fact that these physicists that we were saying that like were also once taught by teachers using metaphors in the same kind of way. So it's like we all can reach that status if we choose to, but these metaphors are very important in getting us to actually get on that road to get to that destination. No pun